In the silence between seasons, a journey through grief, memory, and the quiet love that lingers in the spaces we once shared. I didn't plan to come back, but sometimes the road turns in a way you can't ignore. 3 weeks ago, a call reached me just before midnight. My sister had died. Car accident. No one else claimed her. They said I was the only contact left. The train ride back was quiet. Outside the window, early spring flickered past bare trees trying to remember how to bloom. I arrived just as the sky turned gray. The rain hadn't started yet, but the air felt heavy, as if the clouds were holding their breath. The house was the same, peeling paint, ivy creeping along the sides, gravel crunching under my shoes. I stood in front of the gate for a while, unsure if I should knock on a door no one would open. The wind moved the branches above, and the smell of damp earth rose up around me. I pushed the gate open. It gave easily, like it had been waiting. Inside, the silence pressed in. The floors creaked in familiar ways. Some photos still hung on the walls, slightly tilted. I looked at them out of habit, but didn't stop. I wasn't ready to meet those faces again. Her room was upstairs. I climbed slowly, pausing at each step, not from tiredness, but because everything felt too still. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The door to her room was closed. I opened it gently, like I was afraid of waking her. It was neat, not empty, just quiet. The kind of quiet that lives in places where people stop hoping someone will visit. The bed was made, books stacked on the nightstand, a pair of slippers neatly placed by the closet. It looked like she had planned to return. I walked in and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress gave under my weight, unfamiliar now. There was a small box under the nightstand. Inside were notebooks, plain and worn. I picked one up. The pages were filled with her handwriting, small, careful, and not quite even. I flipped through them, not reading at first, just moving my fingers across the pages. She had been writing right up until the end. Short entries, observations, pieces of days that must have felt too quiet to hold alone. A few words stood out here and there. Weather, garden, and names I didn't recognize. I kept reading, and eventually I found pieces of myself in her pages. Not often, just enough to feel the weight of everything I had missed. There was an old photograph tucked between two pages. We were sitting under the apricot tree in the backyard, maybe 10 and 14. I remembered that day barely. It was summer. Our mother had brought out popsicles. We were still speaking to each other then, still living in the same rhythm. I stared at the photo for a long time before putting it back. Later, I went to the garden. The tree was still there, older now, its branches stretching outward like they had forgotten how to reach upward. No flowers bloomed. The soil was dry. I knelt and brushed away the dead leaves. Beneath them, I found small stones arranged in a loose circle. I didn't know what they meant. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. That night, I slept in her bed. I thought I'd lie awake, but sleep came quickly. In the early hours, I dreamed of a field where it never rained. She was there, standing far away, her hair moving in the wind. I didn't call out. I just watched her until she turned and walked out of sight. In the morning, I walked through the house, touching things I hadn't thought about in years. The chipped ceramic cup she always used. The scarf I left behind when I moved out. I opened the closet in the hallway and found a box with my name written on the side. Inside were small things, notes I wrote in school, a dried flower from a trip we took once, and a necklace I thought I had lost. She had kept them all. I sat on the floor and let the quiet hold me. There was no anger in the room, no blame, just the kind of emptiness that comes after something has ended and no one noticed. I didn't cry, not at first. It wasn't until I started cleaning the kitchen that it came. I found a grocery list in her handwriting, and for some reason that did it. The simplicity of it. The way it proved she had planned for another day. I leaned against the counter and let the tears come, not loudly, just enough to clear something inside. I spent the rest of the day sorting through her things. Most of them I didn't keep. But I couldn't throw away the notebooks, or the photo, or the stones. At dusk, I went back to the apricot tree. The wind had picked up again and the sky looked like it might break. I sat on the bench and watched the last light fade through the branches. This was where we used to talk, back when things were still simple. I tried to remember what it had felt like to sit here beside her without weight. I couldn't. Not fully. We hadn't spoken in years. There were reasons. Some of them are clear, others less so. There had been a boy, a moment I didn't think mattered. But it did. Not because of what happened, but because of what followed. The silence. The distance. I had moved away and never looked back. She stayed. She carried it all in quiet ways I never saw. Now there was no one left to explain. Before I left, I wrote her a letter. I didn't say much, just what came naturally. I placed it under the stones in the garden. It didn't feel like enough. But sometimes there's nothing you can say that hasn't already been said in the spaces between words. I locked the house and left the key with the neighbor. They said they'd take care of it until I figured out what to do. On the train ride back, the rain finally started. It hit the windows in steady, gentle patterns. I watched it for a long time. It didn't feel like a storm, just something necessary. The city greeted me the way it always did, impersonal, fast, and indifferent. I walked the familiar streets, past the same cafes and storefronts, but everything felt a step removed, like I had returned with someone else's memories folded into mine. I kept one of her notebooks. I didn't know why. Maybe to remind myself of who she was, or maybe to remember who I had been. Some days I take it out and read a few pages, not in order, just one at a time the way she must have written them. Some are empty, others say more than they mean to. And sometimes in the quiet moments, I can almost hear her voice in the spaces between the lines. Time doesn't move faster, but it does become quieter. I went back to work. I answered emails. I returned to the rhythm of my days. But something small had shifted, like a thread pulled loose from a tightly woven cloth. I could feel the gap, even if no one else noticed. The notebook stayed on my nightstand. I found myself reaching for it without thinking. I started writing in the margins little reflections, memories, and confessions. Not for anyone else. Just for her. Just for me. One evening, while leafing through a page marked with a pressed clover, I noticed a sentence scribbled faintly along the bottom edge. She doesn't know I still wait. The ink had faded. The meaning hadn't. I read it again. It felt like it wasn't written for the page, but for the silence that had always hung between us. A silence built not from one moment, but from years of not knowing how to return. Maybe she had waited for an apology, or a visit, or something I never gave. I visited the house again in late summer. The ivy had grown thicker. The apricot tree bore no fruit, but its shade was still there, like an old promise no one had broken. The stones in the garden had shifted slightly, as if touched by wind or memory. I didn't move them. Inside, the dust had settled in a way that made everything look softer. I stayed longer this time. Not to clean, not to organize. Just to be there. To let the rooms remember. I opened all the windows, let the air in. It carried the scent of dry grass and distance. The silence didn't feel as heavy. It felt like a presence. That night, I wandered into the garden again. The moon was thin and high, casting light that barely touched the ground. I stood beneath the tree and remembered a time before things cracked. Before distance. Before choices. Before the silence. I pressed my palm to the trunk, rough and cool. I whispered nothing. There were no words to offer, only breath, only memory. The next morning, I packed the rest of the notebooks, not to take them, just to put them in order. Her handwriting grew shakier toward the end. The final entry was only a date, no words, just the mark of time. I left the house without closing the windows. The neighbor would notice, or the wind would. It felt right, letting the air stay. Back in the city, I found myself walking differently. Not slower, but with more notice. I began collecting small things again, bus tickets, flower petals, and torn pages from magazines. Things I might have once shared with her. I tucked them between the notebook's pages, a strange ritual of connection. One afternoon, I sat in the park and watched a child spin in circles, arms wide, head tilted to the sky. It reminded me of her carefree in a way I had forgotten existed. I smiled without knowing why. I didn't tell anyone what I had done. No grand confessions, no posts or photos. Grief, I learned, is a quiet companion. It walks beside you until you forget when it first arrived. And by then, it has changed into something else. Not lighter, just known. On the notebook's last page, in my own handwriting, I wrote a single sentence. I think I remember how to stay. It wasn't about staying in one place. It was about staying present. In the ache, in the joy, in the stories that weren't finished. She hadn't left me instructions. But in her quiet, in her waiting, I found a path back not to her exactly, but to the version of me who once loved more openly, who once believed that some ties, even frayed, still held. I visit the garden in my mind often now. The tree, the stones, the echo of her steps. It's always dusk there, always soft. Maybe that's what healing becomes, an invisible garden where we place the pieces that still matter. And maybe in some way she's there too. Still waiting, still whole.